Good evening, everyone. There's some more seats up front if people in the back want to come up. Welcome to Union Theological Seminary. I'm Serene Jones, the president of this institution, getting close to being 200 years old. And since its inception, this school, it hasn't always been in this place, but it has been a school that's been committed to pursuing the cause of social justice, not just within the walls of religious communities, but in the broader world. The school was started, interestingly, by a group of pastors from up the road in New Haven and from down the road in Princeton, who left those seminaries and said, we don't think you can learn what it means to be ministers and even come to an understanding of who God is in the world if you're not immediately and constantly immersed in the pressures and realities of the world. So they literally started this school by setting up on the docks of New York City. And at that time, in 1836, setting up on the docks meant that you were constantly engaged with questions related to immigration. Huge numbers of immigrants were flowing into the city, and at the same time, the questions of refugees. What does it mean to have marginal and vulnerable populations coming into a metropolis that doesn't yet even understand its boundaries or size? And those were questions from the beginning that gave life to the profound theology that has happened here over the years. It's not a surprise that this school has given birth to some of the leading public intellectuals over the last 200 years. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Reinhold, Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, our own James Cone, Dolores Williams, and the list goes on. It's this kind of environment that breeds a theology that it's too shallow to call it cutting edge. It's theology that cuts deep into the ground that we all stand upon. And in this present context, that ground that we all stand upon is quaking. It's quaking because of the forces of climate change. It's also quaking because of what's happening in our country today. The title of this evening's conversation is Religion and Faith in the Time of Trump. Who of us would have imagined that we would be at this point in time right now dealing with what we're dealing with? This is part of a series of free public discussions that we've initiated this year called Faith in America. On March 22nd, we're going to have a very important conversation about the role that unconscious forces play in the activities and processings that groups go through. And we think this conversation is critical for anyone who wants to engage in the work of social change, be it in community organizing or inside institutions, understanding how groups work. Maybe if we better understood how groups work, we wouldn't be where we are right now. On April 5th, we're going to be having a speech and then a panel discussion by the Nobel Prize Peace winner Lema Gbowee, the woman about whom the film by Abigail Disney, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, was made. An amazing woman from Africa engaged in peacemaking. On the 20th of April, we'll have the Reverend Dr. William Barber here. This will be a chance. We have an opportunity to hear Reverend Barber speak publicly on many issues on television and on the radio and on YouTube, but we very rarely have a chance to have a conversation with him. This evening will be open to the community to ask him and engage him in questions. We're also very lucky that he's a visiting professor here. This evening, we're very thrilled to have Anthony Romero, who is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union. I just always say ACLU, it just comes out that fast because it is a household name for so many of us who have been involved in this work for the long haul. And it is such a thrill and such a treasured moment for Anthony, you to be here with us, particularly at this time in our nation's history. I'm going to invite Fred Davey up in a minute to introduce Mr. Romero, but first I want to tell you about the rest of the evening. Anthony Romero will make comments, and then we'll have a panel discussion, which I will moderate. It'll be questions back and forth, and I want to introduce the people who will be coming up for that. We're going to be joined by Dorrien, Reverend Gary Dorrien, who is a graduate of Union, and he holds the Reinhold Niebuhr Professorship in Social Ethics. And he's also a professor at Columbia. He's a prolific writer about all of the topics that we will be discussing. And he was the recipient just several months ago of the most prestigious book award given in the United States to someone who writes about religion, the Grommeyer Award, for his book, The New Abolition, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Black Social Gospel. So Gary, we're glad you're going to be with us. Next, we're going to have Jerusha Lamptey, who is an assistant professor of Islam and ministry here at Union, and the author of a wonderful book that is being read literally around the world, called Never Wholly Other, a Muslima theology of religious pluralism. And in this book, she explores issues related to gender and to difference and to otherness within the context of the Quran and Islamic traditions. And she's also, we're very excited, the program director of a new track that we have at Union called Islam, Interreligious Engagement, and a center devoted to Islam, interreligious engagement, and social justice. So, Jerusha, very, very glad you're here. And then we have one of our own students, Wesley Morris, who is a Master's of Divinity candidate here. He's going to be graduating, and are you counting the days yet? Less than 80 days, 90, 60 maybe. He is focusing on psychology and religion. He hails from North Carolina, where he worked as a youth pastor, a community organizer, an activist. Here at Union, he's done many things. Presently, he serves as co-chair of Union's Black Caucus. And finally, I would like to introduce the Reverend Fred Davey, who is the executive vice president here at Union. He comes to Union with behind him years and years of deep engagement with a wide variety of social justice issues and New York and DC institutions. Among the many things he does most recently, he's become a member of the Mayor de Blasio's Clergy Advisory Council, and he sits on the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. As Anthony Romero said to me this night, and I know it's true so often at Union, I would do anything for Fred. He's so wonderful. Fred, we're very happy that you are at Union and here tonight. So the Reverend Fred Davey, please come forward and introduce our guest.
Thank you, Serene, and many thanks to Anthony Romero for saying yes when we called him up, I think probably less than a week ago, and asked him, or maybe about a week ago, asked him if he would be willing to come and talk to us tonight, given all that's going on in the country right now, and given the role that the ACLU is playing in addressing a whole range of issues that are really important to all of us. Anthony and I have known each other now, I think, for almost 20 years. We were colleagues at the Ford Foundation and struck up a friendship, and we've been friends ever since. He's been a real inspiration to me in so many ways, but there's nothing more valuable than the type of friendship we've been able to develop over the years. So let me just formally introduce to you Anthony D. Romero. As Serene said, he is the executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the nation's premier defender of liberty and individual freedom, an attorney with a history of public interest activism. Anthony has presided over the most successful membership growth in the ACLU's history and a large increase in national and state affiliate staff. This extraordinary growth has allowed the ACLU to expand its nationwide litigation, lobbying, advocacy, and public education programs. Mr. Romero is the ACLU's 6th executive director and the first Latino and openly gay man to serve in that capacity. Born in New York City to parents who hailed from Puerto Rico, Anthony was the first in his family to graduate from high school. He is a graduate of Stanford University Law School and Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs. He's a man on the move, a man who is in the right place at the right time for this nation. He's my friend, and it's a pleasure to introduce you to Anthony Romero. Anthony.
So to President Jones, I thank you for inviting me to your beautiful home and to share company with you and with many in the audience. I see some friends and faces I have not seen in a while, and I'm just delighted to be in your company. To the Reverend Fred Davey, I owe you much. I'm trying to pay it back little by little. Keep praying for me. I need those prayers, and so as long as you keep praying, I'll keep answering your call. And to the rest of you, I just want to thank you for making the time out of very busy lives and busy schedules and to join me, hopefully, in a discussion about where we are and where the country is headed. And I'm especially pleased to be in a place with the spirit of this chapel at Union Theological Seminary to talk about some very difficult and challenging issues, but to do so in a way that builds the bridge from both sides of the river. And rather than have individuals on one side of the debate fighting with others on the other side of a debate, having a zero-sum struggle that often delights the media or followers on social media, it's going to be great to have a very civil, thoughtful conversation, that we keep civil society alive and keep it a little bit more civil than we've seen in quarters recently in our nation. Now, it's no secret that the ACLU and I believe that Donald Trump has vowed to implement an agenda that is profoundly at odds with the spirit and the letter of the Bill of Rights. My organization is a nonpartisan organization. We have never endorsed or opposed any candidate for elected or appointed office in our 97-year history. We don't have a PAC. We don't run a voter registration drive. We don't engage in the electoral activities of our nation's campaigns or elections. That's not because it's not important, but that's because we believe that we need to do our best to rise above a fray and not to engage in partisan politics of picking candidates at particular times, one against the other. We work with Republicans and we work with Democrats, and we fight them both when necessary. We earn our credibility by standing up to otherwise wonderful leaders who go down the wrong track. And lamentably, almost every single one of our great nation's leaders has erred when it comes to civil liberties and civil rights. I think we first earned our stripes when we were able and had the courage of our convictions to stand up to a great progressive icon, FDR. And when FDR signed the executive order to intern 120,000 Japanese Americans and put them in internment camps, ours was the only national organization that had the courage to fight FDR during a very difficult time in a war that was stripping apart our nation and our world. Only the ACLU and the Quakers, I would add, had the courage to defy FDR's order. We brought the case in 1941 on behalf of Fred Korematsu, a case that would go to the Supreme Court in 1944 that we would lose, and ultimately win reparations for Japanese Americans almost 50 years later under President Ronald Reagan. We earned our stripes by holding President Obama's feet to the fire. And otherwise, a president that we applauded on many of his commitments to questions of racial justice and gender equality, he did also err on some of the policies and programs that affected the rights of immigrants. Deported the largest number of immigrants in any modern history of a modern president. We fought him on things like drones and the use of unmanned vehicles to drop bombs on U.S. citizens in non-theaters of war like in Yemen. We fought him aggressively on the NSA surveillance program, a case we brought all the way again up to the Supreme Court and lost. And so I think that my organization is one that remains vigilant and alive and focused and aggressive no matter who's in power. These times are a bit different, however. President Trump, from his initial campaign statements, it was clear to us that he would blatantly violate the rights guaranteed in the Constitution, in many of our federal statutes, in international law, and even the basic norms of a decent society. We took President Trump at his word. In July of this year, when most people did not believe that he would become president, and most people did not take him seriously, we issued a 30-page constitutional and legal analysis of how his various positions in different areas would run afoul of our nation's laws. It was a wonky document, long footnotes at the end of each page, written by constitutional litigators, not a picture in the whole report. I think I was one of two people who read it. Yeah, but we prepared that report because we wanted to be ready for the eventuality if he were to win. And we were incredibly glad on November 10th that we had done that homework leading up to the election. Because while many of us were still surprised at the outcome of the election, it was our job to be ready no matter what came. We've taken President Trump to court now in more than 16 different cases that my organization has filed since the election, since inauguration. 16 lawsuits in a little over than 30 days. And at the core of many of these initial lawsuits, which we can get into if you wish, has been this question around religion and faith in our nation's life. At this year's National Prayer Breakfast, President Trump said, I quote, "So I want to express clearly today to the American people that my administration will do everything in its power to defend and protect religious liberty in our land. America must forever remain a tolerant society where all faiths are respected and where all of our citizens can feel safe and secure." His words. So far, so good. Except words are cheap. In the same speech, he also pledged to get rid of, quote, and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment, which in our minds would drag religious institutions into Caesar's mud pit. He's also vowed to impose a religious test on Muslims entering the country. And he would allow businesses and private citizens to use religion as an excuse for the most blatant and hateful sort of discrimination that is un-American. Now, clearly, President Trump and I have very different definitions of the words religious liberty or a tolerant society. And more to the point, I believe we have a very different view of religion's place in the American system. My own view of the role of religious place in the American system is rooted in my own upbringing and background, but also in my understanding and belief in the Constitution. The President's view, I believe, changes from moment to moment, depending on what is politically expedient. He changes his views on abortion throughout the term of his candidacy and then his presidency. It's still unclear. Changes his views even on the Muslim ban, week to week. We wait with bated breath about whether or not they try to redo the executive order that he enacted over 10 days ago. But the problem that we see is that now he and his party have the power to impose what I believe to be an unconstitutional and deeply unchristian policies on our nation and on individuals who do not coincidentally who coincidentally often look like the least among us. I think it's clear that this nation has grown tremendously more tolerant and just over the course of our history, and especially in the last 100 years with the movement of the women's movement and other civil rights movements and the LGBT movement. Ours is a country that has moved to greater inclusion, fairness, and equality. But as we look at Donald Trump's vows, his executive orders, the recent actions, I see a disheartening effort to roll back some of the progress, and that would bring us to some of the more shameful moments in our American history if we allow it to repeat. Let me point out that whatever the religious affiliations of my staff and myself, at the ACLU, we have a long and proud record of defending religious liberty. We were founded in response to the Palmer raids in the 1920s, where you had systematic harassment and arrests of immigrants to the United States by the Attorney General, who was largely driven by anti-Catholic prejudice. As I mentioned, we fought for the rights of the Japanese Americans during World War II, but also for the rights of conscientious objectors. We are on record as being in favor of the right for individual pharmacists to refuse even to fill prescriptions for medications that they object to on moral or religious grounds. And just in the last 5 years, literally among the hundreds of religious liberty cases in which we or our affiliates have been involved, we have defended a Muslim student's right to wear a hijab as part of her uniform at a public military college. We defended the rights of a pastor and his wife to hand out religious literature on a public sidewalk. We defended a student's right to wear rosary beads in a public high school. We defended a Jewish prisoner's rights, to receive a kosher diet when incarcerated. We defended the rights of 2 high school students to wear religiously motivated T-shirts with anti-abortion slogans at school. We defended the right of a Sikh letter carrier to deliver mail at Walt Disney World with his beard and his turban intact. We strongly believe that religious rights are an essential part of our civil rights and civil liberties in the U.S. We do not, however, support the unconstitutional efforts to use religious beliefs to deny the rights of others. And while there are arguably religious or moral overtones to many of the Trump administration's policies and promises, I just want to focus on 3 for tonight and then leave it to a good discussion with the panel. First, the Johnson Amendment. Second, to talk about the First Amendment Defense Act. And third, to close on the Muslim ban, as we call it. Now, the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment forbids any tax-exempt charitable organization defined by the IRS from either endorsing or opposing political candidates. It was championed by then-Senator Lyndon Johnson, adopted in 1954. And as much as my organization is one that believes in the freedom of speech and often thinks skeptically about the role of government in regulating that speech, I think it's generally a bad idea to provide tax benefits for those who are trying to exert political influence. More specifically, the need to repeal the Johnson Amendment is based on a laughable fallacy, I argue. According to Liberty University President Jerry Falwell, he says, quote, "The Johnson Amendment intimidates the leaders of organizations from exercising free speech," end quote. Now, those of you in the religious community in this room and others who are involved in your communities, I'd like to ask whether that is your impression. I haven't noticed the reticence on behalf of religious leaders to speak on important political issues of their time. Religious leaders often speak freely and loudly on political issues. In fact, the political process benefits from the moral and ethical leadership of religious institutions and leadership. Where would the civil rights movement have gone without the leadership of the black church? Where would the civil rights movement have gone without the leadership of Jewish American leaders? And so when I look across this country, I see a country of enormous religious tolerance and religious liberty. I don't see the level of restriction or censure that you find in other so-called enlightened Western European countries. Ours is one of a deeply religious people who have the ability very often, in most cases, to exercise their freedom of religion openly, freely, and with dignity. And so when I hear about the need to strip away the Johnson Amendment under the guise of providing greater religious liberty, I wonder whether there's another motive at play than the one they purport to put forward. Direct taxpayer-subsidized partisanship, with using taxpayer money to lobby through religious institutions and individuals, I think goes a bridge too far. I think that sort of activity diminishes the status of churches, of synagogues, and religious institutions by making them an explicit part of a political system that is almost always far removed from the morality and teachings of the institutions. Reverend Raphael Warnock of Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church told the Associated Press recently, quote, "This opens up a can of worms that would undermine the church's moral authority." I tend to agree. Religious speech is perhaps more free than any other speech in our society, just as it should be. Political speech, on the other hand, because of the importance of transparency and accountability and the integrity of the political process, is the most highly regulated speech in our system. Donors are made public, limits are imposed, the government is charged with ensuring compliance with federal laws. Now, if you impose that same level of scrutiny of political speech onto religious institutions, I fear that will be the beginning of the end of the independence and the vibrancy of religious institutions. You can cite Scripture, even, for some of this. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But the overlap of politics and pulpit raises important questions. Do we, a religious people or religious leaders, wish to trade our freedom to speak from the pulpit for the close scrutiny of the political system for a tax exemption? Or will we find ourselves in a trap where we invite in the government to regulate the most independent and free institutions that are emanations of our soul and our spirits? Second, the First Amendment Defense Act. A second and more malicious way in which I think President Trump and his supporters wish to turn back the clock to the 1950s or before is in his effort to use religion to legitimize bigotry through the Orwellian-named First Amendment Defense Act. There was many of us who anticipated an executive order that would be along these lines, and it appears that the president and his colleagues in the West Wing decided not to implement the executive order that was leaked to even folks like us. But the executive order looks a lot like a draft of a bill that we've seen working its way through Congress now for a number of years. It's the First Amendment Defense Act, FADA, as we call it. It is rooted also in another fallacy, that churches, clergy, and others who oppose marriage equality for religious reasons could be forced to perform religious ceremonies against their will. Now, I can tell you that if any government entity at any time now or in the future were ever to try to force churches or synagogues or religious institutions to perform weddings against their will, that effort would be immediately quashed in the courts, and I'm sure that the ACLU would be leading the charge against it. We do believe that private religious institutions have a right to set their own rules of the road for themselves, and that for religious institutions in the engagement of the propagation of faith, it is for them to have the independence to determine what is best. But that's not at place here with the freedom of the First Amendment Defense Act. It's a fear that's being used to legitimize discrimination against individuals to basically deny the rights of marginal groups and grant rights to corporations and institutions that never had it to begin with. Under the guise of protecting rights, they strip away rights. Now, it's amazing to me that decades after I could be legally discriminated as a Latino for trying to marry an Anglo woman, let's say, by a justice of the peace or a photographer or the owner of a honeymoon cottage, now it would still be lawful to be discriminated against for me trying to marry a man. And the same arguments are being used to justify bigotry today that were being used on the misogyny statutes of the 1950s and early 60s. In 1946, a powerful and legendary Mississippi governor, Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi, wrote, quote, "The purity of the race is a gift of God, and God in his infinite wisdom has so ordained it that when man destroys his racial purity, it can never be redeemed," end quote. Compare that now to the statement of Representative Mike Pence, now Vice President Mike Pence, where he says, quote, "Several millennia ago, the words were written that a man shall leave his mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It was not our idea, it was God's idea. Societal collapse was always brought about by following an advent of the deterioration of marriage and family." So in response to a bunch of written questions by some of the senators, including Senator Al Franken during the confirmation process, our new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, specifically cited concerns about a private university or college potentially losing tax-exempt status if it opposed marriage equality, unless FADA was passed. Yet he was unable to point to a single example of a school being threatened with such action, let alone a case where the tax exemption was actually being revoked. They're making up excuses, using the guise of religion, to force an agenda of discrimination and prejudice. Sessions turns the definition of discrimination on its head. He argued that FADA is necessary to prohibit the federal government from taking discriminatory actions. Now, what Senator Sessions calls discriminatory actions are in fact long-standing civil rights protections. They're the basic rules of the road that should apply to all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, of our gender, of our sexual orientation. And for far too long, LGBT people have begun winning rights that many of us have taken for granted, and that women and racial minorities have fought for and only won in the last several decades. We believe that FADA would significantly undermine the ability of federal agencies tasked with enforcing our nation's civil rights laws. It will not promote religious liberty or religious tolerance, but it will undercut the basic protections for those who are the least among us. Let me turn to the third example of how religion is playing out in Trump's America. It's obviously the question around the Muslim ban. Donald Trump is riding, I would say even leading, a wave of Islamophobia whose virulence recalls even the most challenging times when the Massachusetts Bay Colony executed Quakers or Mormon settlers. We see Trump's embrace of this religious bigotry in his executive order, but also in the statements that he and his leaders have uttered. Our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, said, quote, "Islam is a toxic ideology," end quote. An entire religion practiced by wonderful, moral, ethical, engaged individuals. An entire religion has been cast by our Attorney General as a toxic ideology. Now, I dare say if Jeff Sessions had the audacity to stand up and say, Catholicism is a toxic ideology, or Anglicanism is a toxic ideology, or Judaism is a toxic ideology, There is no way America would have let that man put his hand on the Bible and take the oath as the country's Attorney General. And yet, it is perfectly fine for the country's highest-ranking law enforcement official to engage in the greatest disservice and call an entire religion and billions of people toxic. This now gets codified in this executive order that we've seen come down, where they talk about the complete and total shutdown of Muslims entering the US, where President Trump campaigned on a Muslim ban, told us he was going to give us a Muslim ban, consulted Rudy Giuliani on how to construct a Muslim ban, actually writes an executive order that is a Muslim ban. And then when we and others take them to court and people take to the streets, say, it's not a Muslim ban. Well, how can you say? You've picked 7 predominantly Muslim countries, have no direct or explicit tie to the acts of terrorism that we've seen in the last 15 years. Sure, individuals from some of those countries, but there's no clear nexus between these countries and Muslims from these countries to the worst acts of terrorism. The 9/11 attackers, I'll remind you, were predominantly coming from Saudi Arabia. For interesting reasons, Saudi Arabia is not on one of the 7 countries that President Trump has tried to ban. Perhaps most clearly are the statements of the president himself. He is our best ally and his own worst enemy. So before he signs his executive order, he does an interview on Christian broadcast radio and tells the Christian listeners of that radio show that he is going to carve out, that the executive order carves out a protection for minority religions because Christians have been persecuted in these countries. I don't argue with the fact that often Christians are persecuted in some countries. I argue with the fact that when you clearly ban 7 predominantly Muslim countries and you carve out an exception for minority religions, you're in clear violation of the free exercise and non-establishment clauses of the US Constitution. The First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right to petition a government, the right to freedom of religion, and the right to not have a religion established on us. Freedom of exercise and non-establishment means a government neither favors nor discriminates against any one particular religion. And yet clearly in the language of this executive order, where they're carving out an exception for minority religions, they run afoul of the First Amendment. That was one of the easiest pieces of our brief that we filed. Within 16 hours of him signing the executive order, we had jumped into federal court. And then the day after, that Saturday evening at 8 o'clock, we're able to secure a stay from the Eastern District federal judge banning the government from trying to implement that order. Since then, there have been close to 24 other Muslim ban cases, more than 12 filed by us, and another dozen or so filed by other great legal groups and individual lawyers. It's clear that what we are involved with now, as they think about revising the Muslim ban executive order, where they want to now allow the refugees to be resettled in the US. They're a very sympathetic population, so it's a way to take some of the air out of the debate. They want to take away the specific carve-out for the protection of minority religions. I'll be very interested to see what happens with Mr. Trump's base when they find that after speaking on Christian broadcast radio on the need to protect Christians, he perhaps is not so committed to the protection of Christians as they had once thought and he had once said. We still think that even if he does those changes in an executive order that we anticipate as early as tomorrow, next week, it still runs afoul of our nation's non-discrimination clauses. Let me close. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, he probably never envisioned the diversity and the vibrancy of modern-day America. He never envisioned that millions of what he called Mohammedan immigrants and refugees would be washing up on our shores. But he was wise enough to include them within, quote, the mantle of its protection, along with, quote, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination, wrote Thomas Jefferson. He and the Founding Fathers had a very clear vision of the bitter religious wars in England and on the European continent. They knew that that level of acrimony and violence based along religious lines would drive countries to war and drive good people to other shores. By embracing tolerance and rejecting the establishment of a state religion, they were almost visionary and counterintuitively protecting freedom of religion so it could flourish here in a way that was not seen in any modern nation of their time. Much of that, I fear, is at risk. It's at risk because we have political leaders pandering to a base, using some of our most hallowed values and some of our most significant thoughts as a way to drive up popularity ratings and polls. When President Trump pledges that his administration will do everything in its power to defend and protect religious liberty in our land, that's a statement I can agree with. The actions by which he purportedly endeavors to do so, however, threatens to undercut the very goal he has set out for himself. I think in this time of alternative facts and of individuals who seem to change their minds and play to another moment in the Colosseum, those of us who have the understanding and the commitment to push through some difficult issues need to step up. Our democracy can be a great many things, but it can never be a spectator sport. If it becomes a spectator sport, our democracy will suffer. And if there are individuals from religious institutions and of faith who have trouble or challenge some of the policy of the Trump administration, it's incredibly important that we hear from you all. Yours is a voice that is unique in the American body politic. At times of despair and times of acrimony, at times of division, it is only the moral and ethical leadership of our religious and moral leadership that can step up and shine the light and the way forward. We have to appeal in moments of great division, of hatred, of growing violence, of families being ripped apart from each other. We have to hold up a candle of hope and light. We have to model goodness. The best way to fight the Trump administration's policies are by individual acts of kindness, with a sense of ethics, with a sense of dignity, with a sense of morality. The way we fight Trump is not just by the lawsuits we file, not just by the protests we attend. It's by defying and denying his ability to change the way we live and we treat each other. And what better way to deny and defy such a legacy than to reach deep into the foundations of our religious institutions and in places as hallowed as this, and to begin to draw up the sustenance with which to do that work. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you. There is so much in your words to reflect on together here. And I want to start off with two questions to you, Anthony. And the first is a personal question. As at the end, when you took what we would call the preaching moment, you took the preaching step, but you began to talk about the role that hope plays and the role that our deepest commitments and values play in how we stand up. I would be very interested to know what role faith communities played or didn't play in your own formation to bring you to where you are now and take the positions you have.
So this is where I run the risk of getting fired, because
So no one repeat this, okay?
No, it's okay. There are a couple of hints every once in a while when someone looks closely enough in my office. I have a little crucifix of a wooden crucifix of Jesus behind my desk. I actually have a copy of the Bible on my shelf next to the Constitution. I have a couple of medallions that are in my desk drawer, and a couple of prayers that I look at when I'm looking out of my desk. And the Catholic Church is probably the one institution that has had the most significant positive impact on my life. I would not be here today but for the kind of the assistance of Catholic charities, Catholic home services, Catholic schools. My mom was very religious. My father was politely agnostic. And I would, as a little boy, when we were living in the Bronx, my mother's she's no longer alive, was painfully shy. She was one of these brilliant women who was always afraid to open her mouth too much. And I was always a bit of an extrovert, as you can imagine. And so when we were on the buses in the Bronx, I would actually get up on the buses and I would preach the parables. And then I would collect money. And then I would put it in this Sunday collection basket. And it was always like, my mother's like, oh, there he goes again. And
it's fundraising skills.
it was exactly what I do today, except I don't do the buses as much. I still try. I think in moments when I struggle, and I've struggled a lot, in moments when I feel despair, it's that early teaching, and it's not exclusive, I don't think, to a Catholic upbringing or a religious upbringing. I think it's a morality that our parents find ways of inculcating in us, no matter how they teach it. For me, it was largely through being exposed to the Bible, and I think it's still, a lot of my colleagues at the ACLU may feel differently about the role of religion in their own personal lives. I happen to think that that's okay. I don't need to agree with everyone I work with. I also think that I benefit from having a grounding with family who have a different vision. My mother's most important institution is not the ACLU, even though I've been there for 16 years. It's her local parish. And the sense of fellowship and community and assistance, I think, is incredibly important. And folks like us who are sometimes in the middle of this battle, they call us the Anti-Christian Liberties Union. And you should see that, the Christmas cards, we have a kind of a religious ministry that has put us on their email. And so right after Thanksgiving, we get flooded with hundreds of thousands, literally, of Christmas cards. And we have to open them up because November and December is also a time when people send us checks, right? So you can't just throw them all out. And some of them are just hilarious, where you kind of like, Jesus loves you, but I hate you. And it's just like, may you rot in hell. And every once in a while, someone will write you a very kind of crazy card, and then they'll still enclose a check. And then you're kind of like, well, this is a miracle. But I think it's incredibly important for us to remain supportive of religious institutions. And sometimes my organization and my profession and my colleagues, we don't do a good enough job of extending ourselves that way. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer to your question.
Well, thank you, and you just led into my second question. Also at the end, you exhorted us here at Union Theological Seminary to not stand on the sidelines, but as a religious institution, take a position. And in our classrooms every day, we're teaching students and having discussions, students among themselves with the faculty, about these issues. And all of it involves taking positions and having the courage to do it. The day after Trump was elected, our faculty unanimously signed a statement stating as deplorable the values that he ran upon. We immediately responded to the Muslim ban with a strong statement directed specifically at Christians who wanted to use theological justifications for this. And most recently, this hasn't been announced yet, but we're becoming a sanctuary seminary. So we do this all the time, and sometimes the frustration in a progressive religious institution like this that we feel is that there's so many of our secular progressive partners who don't listen to what we're saying, for whom religion is completely filled with the category of those white evangelical Christians who elected Trump. So the sort of invisibility in a progressive secular world of the progressive religious presence in this country. How did we get to this place, and what do we have to do to shift that?
You know, it is a challenge, and I think some of the most important ways. I was speaking to a group of rabbis. I don't know. It was Super Bowl Sunday, so they found the gay guy who doesn't watch Super Bowl, and I was the only one who would come and talk to them on Super Bowl Sunday. And they asked me some of the same questions. How do we bridge this divide? Reform leaders of synagogues, some of the more orthodox. And I think it requires a conscious outreach, which can be done. To even for those of us who describe ourselves as progressive religious leaders or of progressives, to reach across the ideological line and to find common ground with leaders and institutions that are not on the same side of the political spectrum can be incredibly powerful. And those moments can create really important breakthroughs, especially today. I'll give one example, and then I'm sure we want to hear from other folks. The same night that Oklahoma sent its 3 electoral votes to Donald Trump, Oklahoman voters passed 2 ballot referenda that were the most progressive criminal justice reform ballot referenda in the country. And we had sponsored that referendum. We invested about $3.5 million, basically to retroactively and prospectively reclassify about a dozen former felonies and classify them mandatorily as misdemeanors, nonviolent property crimes, nonviolent drug crimes. And we picked Oklahoma because it had the second highest incarceration rate in the nation, and it's a deep red state. It's not a light red state, it's not a purple state, it's deep red, ruby red.
I'm from Oklahoma.
Okay. And we were a lot of the instigators behind it, but with the leadership of it included Republicans, people like Clay Bennett from the Oklahoma City Thunder, individuals who were in the House of Representatives in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, evangelical and Christian leaders from the state. They could talk about the value of redemption and our belief in a second chance in a way that was much more compelling and much more resonant than some egg-heady ACLU lawyer in the Oklahoma affiliate. And I think these moments of being able to really, I don't think it's possible in Washington. I think it's just too charged and it's too difficult, and the Montagues and the Capulets will just be glad to fight each other and hope, not get anything done. I still think at the local and at the state level, there's a great deal of possibility of reaching with progressive religious leadership, with individuals who are self-identified conservative religious leadership, and finding places of common ground. And we don't have to agree on everything, but we should agree on some things, and let's work on the things that we agree on, is what I would suggest.
Well, just building on that, we can stay with Oklahoma for a minute, and I want to turn to Jerusha Lamptey and ask you, Jerusha, how this election, in the time of Trump, has affected what you do. Anthony talked about Islamophobia. I can promise you if there was any referendum related to Islam in Oklahoma, it would have failed miserably. In fact, they've had several attempts to pass laws prohibiting Sharia law as if that's actually, it's a fantasy that's been created in Oklahoma. So Jerusha, just since the inauguration, we could even just begin there, how has this impacted the work that you do, and how has it changed the arena that you find yourself in?
Yeah, so I would say in one way...
Get this a little closer to you.
Okay, is it on? In one way, I think that it is a continuation of the work that I've been doing. And I'm speaking specifically to the work level, probably the more public side of trying to influence or reshape the discourse around Muslims and Islam in this country. And I've devoted a number of years, probably 15 straight, to trying to interject ideas of diversity, to combat monolithic representations of Islam, positive but multiple visions of what Muslim women are like in particular, but also just Muslims in general, that we have good, bad, wonderful, kind of good, sometimes good, lovely, all sorts of different types of people. And I guess one of the big changes, there's been two big changes that I would highlight. And one I mentioned before we started talking this evening, and that's that one comes to a point when one realizes that you can't necessarily fill up a cup anymore if it's already filled with something else. And so what I mean by that is that I've always been aware of the degree of Islamophobia in this country. And I think that's something that many people are just coming to realize. And so when Anthony mentions Jeff Sessions saying this, and then just, a lot of people didn't like him, but that wasn't necessarily the number one reason why they didn't like him. All of the other reasons are egregious as well. But we could make a flow chart of how many people in this administration, and the ones and the ones that have been there for a long time, who had equally horrible things to say, who receive funding from organizations whose sole endeavor is to demonize Muslims in this country, who influence policy, who train military people, who train police officers in this country. That's what they do. What my point was is that people are becoming aware of that. I was always aware of that in my work. But what I've realized now is that I thought I could combat that effectively by just teaching actual content about Muslims and Islam, whether that be religious content or social content or cultural content. But right now I'm realizing that there is too much hate already there that needs to be dealt with. And there are storylines about Islam that I sit at home at night and think, where did this come from? I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm not practicing Islam, or maybe I haven't studied enough, but I have no idea where this is coming from. So anti-Sharia legislation, I don't know where all the Muslims running around wanting to enact Sharia are. I mean, they wouldn't even sit down to agree on a definition of what Sharia is, first of all, never mind try to enact anything. So my first point is that that's one thing that I've come to. I have to really think about, can content really overturn the hate, or do we have to be introspective about the types of prejudices that we hold? And that's hard work. And the second thing is maybe more hopeful, and that's that for the first time in the last 16 years, I'm seeing large segments of this country stand up and say, you know what? Islamophobia is like racism, is like sexism, is like ableism, is like homophobia. It's a prejudice. It's not just an understandable reaction to violence. And I've heard that a lot. I've heard that, well, we don't like Muslims because Muslims do bad things. Or you should be okay with getting stopped and patted down every time you go in the airport because you just want to be safe. It's reactive. And I'm seeing a lot of people say, I don't think it's reactive. And I commend people on that, and I encourage you to keep going.
Well, Wesley, I'll ask you the same question. As a student organizer now, because you're a student, but with a long history of community organizing, and you're a millennial. You're an activist who is a millennial, involved in Black Lives Matter, involved in Moral Mondays, and the list goes on and on. But in the student world and in the millennial world, how have you seen this impact the way people understand what the political task ahead is, and how the ACLU and the sort of question of civil liberties comes into that political understanding?
Yeah, First, I want to thank Dr. Romero and Dr. Lamptey for opening up such a rich conversation to have. And as an organizer, it's varying degrees, what I'm about to say, of how I understood the election season. The first thing I'll say is that the general shock and the general surprise that I sense is almost as equally disturbing as the set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. I say that for two reasons. One, because I'm a young black man living in the United States of America that has some sense of a people's history of this nation. Secondly, I'm from North Carolina, where we've had a governor, Pat McCrory, who was just unelected, where we have been fighting this kind of thing. What I want to say is that the kind of daily suffering that organizing, and I know you all are in touch with this, that Ivane Jabara talks about, the cross, the daily evils. These are the kinds of things that folks are wrestling with, and if we are not in touch with that language or that context, it is really hard to move forward a full process of a mass movement for change, which is what I really think that we really need. And so much of this was framed in a short conversation that she had around water and soap. She said that some days I had water and some days I didn't have soap. Some days I had soap and some days I did not have water. And that is a different reality from the generals and the folks of her society that she talked about that couldn't understand that. It's not their language. It's not their context. So some of the proposals that came out for change, particularly from Black Lives Matter, and young people in Ferguson and Missouri and Baltimore, and all over this country, that really took a step outside of civility, was civilly disobedient, and were considered abhorrent by many people that were onlookers, were actually the call that we should have heeded. These are the folks that had sacrificed many things like generations before that were telling us that something was on the way. And many of them, and myself included, and I know I really appreciated seeing my professor, Dr. Lamptey, with me, marching in the streets. Some of these things have been going on for such a long time, and the thread of shock that erupted for me wasn't necessarily the election. It was 2 weekends ago in Florida when there was a rally. It was opened up by the First Lady, Melania. She read the Lord's Prayer with such conviction. And that kind of conviction of the Lord's Prayer over what we've already seen does something about the conversation of religion. And it shifts it into a way that we have to really wrestle about, okay, what is the moral authority of the church? And is it being embodied by the young people or the elders that are actually standing against it? So the moral authority question for me always resides in the actions and the activity of those that are doing the work to stand up for everyone, to live into what it means to have a vision of the beloved community, and to answer a question that Grace Lee Boggs raises, who is an Asian American activist who passed away a couple of years ago, a dear friend who has led many of us young people into this struggle in new ways by asking this same question, that this next American revolution that is coming and is now here may not necessarily be about equality. It's about who is considered human. And in that question, I found a resonance with people that I love and I care about. So when we see the unveiling of anti-transgender laws that are being rolled back, unless we know what it's like to live in the shoes of a transgender body, or what it's like to live in the shoes of a black woman, or to walk around with a hijab and to be tormented in ways in this country, unless we get close to that and figure out what it's like to live without water or soap, and to disdain some of those things, Jesus asked the question, what are you willing to give in that context? So that question of our humanity is what I center my thoughts on. And I come at this from a care model, a model of care organizing. What do you care about? And expanding our categories of care in a way such that it represents ourselves in the way that we have relationships. And Moral Monday is big about that. Expand it until you get uncomfortable. Expand your coalitions until it gets really, 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 really tough to have a full meeting and sit in there. So much of what I'm speaking from is born in me because I've experienced it in my own body, in my own flesh, and I'll stop there and share more later.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So Gary, you as a social ethicist and a prolific writer have just won an award for a book about the Black social gospel movement. And before that, you've written about the social gospel movement in the United States. And as a theological historian, you've long traced the connections between progressive religious movements and the operations of the state and questions of constitutionality and the line between the religious and the secular. And in your new book, The Black Social Gospel, you throw new light on that question. And so I wonder if, in terms of our discussion today, you could throw some light on this moment in terms of what we can learn from the past, these previous movements, about what it takes to take a step forward, and the role in particular that civil liberties and civil rights play in that place where the religious and the secular come together. I know you could write 10 books about that, but just and you have written 10 books about that. But if you could just throw out some framing issues for us.
Well, firstly, I was thinking I was going to get the same question, as these two, and was sort of anticipating, just admitting that I don't know yet what I'm being called to in this moment. I have a feeling that it's going to be a new departure. I'm going to be called to something that I haven't been doing lately. That what I'm doing of late is just the same thing I've been doing for the past 35 years, because I've been in this work for a long time. I was a solidarity organizer and community organizer for years before I joined a church. Shortly after that, I was ordained and ended up serving in a church. So now I'm serving as a pastor, and I have no history whatsoever of being a church member. So I had to even learn what this church thing is about while I was there. And I was thinking about when Anthony asked this wonderful question about how clergy feel about the Johnson Amendment, because what it took me to was the Johnson Amendment was my lifeline. I mean, I dragged my congregation into the nuclear freeze and the sanctuary movement and 3 other movements that I had just been involved in, and was constantly accused of, dragging politics into religion. And that Johnson line was just what I clung to say, no, it's quite clear where the line is.
And just to jump in here, you probably don't know, but Raphael Warnock is a union graduate and on our board of trustees.
Yes,
so
that's right.
No wonder he said that. So.
Yes. Having that line has been a godsend for many of us for whom, yes, we have to know where it is, because we are we're right up against it all the time, and constantly having to make the case, the fact that you would have to be an awfully shallow, superficial religion that didn't bring you into the public sphere in which you're dealing with issues of justice, right? So that work is just requisite to I think to ministry. So far as what the connection between that and then what work I did and have done since on social gospel and similar kinds of topics, I did come into a church commitment, actually joining a church and then becoming ordained, and then only quite a few years later becoming an academic, through activism that I noticed was mostly taking place in religious communities. I mean, the sanctuary movement was basically a church movement. And so much of the nuclear freeze movement was as well. And the, in effect, preemptive peace movement that formed in those years, that was ready to go the moment we invaded Nicaragua or El Salvador, was indeed almost all of it took place through religious communities. So that was the fulcrum, the sort of medium through which I was already there when I sort of found that perhaps I just need to see through this religious calling. And I'm grateful to have had 7 years in the parish before I became an academic. I do see things a bit differently in the work here at Union from having done it. But having resisted an academic calling for a long time, it was just because I saw that what fired me, what held me, what inspired me in doing basically social justice ministry within a congregational context and an ecumenical context could also be done, and also there was scholarship to be done related to it that I could only really do if I went the rest of the way and became an academic. So the work itself underlies almost everything I've done. There is a philosophy of religion track in my scholarship that pretty much just flies with Kant and Hegel and deals with theoretically interesting issues, but most of it for me is how the faith impacts in social justice struggles.
And one of the things that's so interesting about Gary's work, which is common knowledge here at Union, but oftentimes when we talk about religious America, we don't realize that the social gospel movement was itself an evangelical movement, that the history of evangelical Christianity in the United States has been radical and progressive, and that what we're seeing now is a new phenomenon. But Anthony, I want to give you a chance to respond to what we've just heard.
No, I think it's great. I'm encouraged and enlightened, and especially Wesley, seeing your leadership, I have faith that we're in for brighter days. It's always the young folk who inspire us, and I mean that not in a condescending way, but great confidence in the future when we have folks like you coming through. I want to go back to the Johnson Amendment for a second, because it has been a bright line. It's been a bright line on both sides. So it's a bright line on where we want religious leaders not to cross so that they don't get too enmeshed in partisan politics. It's also the line that keeps the government out of our institutions. And this fight, once broached through legislation, is going to require a different type of leadership. We'll be there. We have to be there. It's too much at the heart of the separation of church and state. We'll make our best arguments as lobbyists, as litigators. We'll try to deploy our folks. We need religious leaders who have the moral authority, like your board member, to speak up and to talk about the challenges for religion and for people of faith. That's going to be most resonant. And I would just say that the one thing, I cut it out because it was going on too long, but one of the things I wanted to highlight for religious leaders and religious institutions is that if you are unleashed to enter partisan politics and unfettered in the way the Johnson Amendment does constrain you, like anything in politics, there will be winners and losers. And the more money you collect, the bigger the winner you will be. Right? All we need to look at, I can point you to a number of studies of industries and businesses that had never engaged into partisan politics and then felt a need to, most recently Silicon Valley, that beautiful little idyllic city on the hill on the West Coast, understood about a decade ago that they couldn't afford not to be involved in beltway politics, and so now all of these great companies with lofty slogans like "Do no evil," right, is the slogan of one that we use, spends a fortune on political action. The question is, do we want that out of our religious institutions? There are going to be denominations that raise and spend a lot on the political arena. They're going to be the winners. The poor congregations serving some of the communities that we often care about are not going to collect the money for their political action committee the way that other denominations will. And I think among religious leaders, I mean, part of what I've learned in my life and with the limited training I have, but with friends like the Reverend Fred Davey, there is a certain understanding about the importance of recognizing the equality of different religions even when they're not ours, right? There's the ecumenical nature of valuing religion among sectarian institutions. I think that's what Union Theological stands for. And when you break away that norm of equality, of the ecumenical nature that we're all peers, And then you create a situation where you have winners and losers, and big spenders and little spenders, and people who are outspent, and people who are trounced, and people who are defeated. Oh my God, is that what we want? Out of your most important, hallowed institutions, is that really what you're going to allow? Because it's your institutions that get trampled. Right? It's our First Amendment, it's our separation of church and state. But it's places like this that become a lot less like hallowed ground. And I feel different when I walk into places like this than I do onto K Street, where I spend a lot of time with paid lobbyists to move my agenda forward. And I just think it's a moment of real reflection and real leadership that requires this community to step forward. And it's an exhortation, and we need you.
So how, last question for panelists, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So how, in the description that you've just given us of what's at stake with the Johnson Amendment being repealed, how do religious institutions, we are officially a nonprofit educational institution, but clearly we're a religious institution in terms of what we teach. So a place like Union, but also a church or mosque, a synagogue, how do they work with the ACLU on this issue? What are some strategies for mobilizing across this divide between the secular and the religious that has kept the two apart?
So first, if there's the appetite and the energy, we welcome hearing from you. And we will find a way to make your role visible and authentic and appropriate for your whatever institution this community represents. There are many times in which we try very hard not to be at all involved in the middle of the debate. I mean, some of the right-of-center individuals expect me to be anti-religion, and wrongly. But that's the stereotype they have of me, and I confirm it by some of the positions I've laid out for the Johnson Amendment. So when we have a lobby day, rather than sending up a whole bunch of my card-carrying members, to send up members of your churches, of your synagogues, of your parishes, we're totally glad to be the facilitators. And there are very often, we will try to find the best messengers to carry the message in the most impactful way, where it doesn't necessarily involve us. So we can help schedule. You don't have to, we know the Hill. We know who do we have to reach. We know we can get appointments. We need the bodies and the leaders and the voices. We can be your channels, if you will. And so if you just make demands on us, we got 20 people who are willing to talk to whomever you want us to talk to about why FATA is bad. I'll book it for you. We'll book it for you. We'll figure it out. We'll figure out the dates. We'll give you out the briefing materials from perspectives. We'll give you the background on who you're talking to, and we'll deploy you in a way that we deploy lots of other folks. But I do think it requires a level of leadership. And I think what's critical is that this is not just one legislative battle, because I think clearly religion in this administration is going to be something that's going to last throughout the 3 or 4 or 8 years even, if we can live that long. I know. One of the things I was just saying before, I'll give you a public service announcement. It's the best, so I spent $18 buying a Trump countdown clock on Amazon. And it's the size of a credit card, so it doesn't cost $18. But I watch it, and it gives you the days, the hours, the minutes, and the milliseconds. And it's on my desk, and sometimes I'm just enraptured by it because I feel like I just watched the whole minute be counted down when he's no longer president. It will keep you sane. It's doing that for me. So, but we have to be ready for however long it is, whether it's 1,430 days, which I think was the countdown from today. We have to be ready for the long haul, and it's going to be critical.
Ready to open it up for, or do y'all want to say any burning things on your mind? Wesley, you look like you're ready to. Go ahead.
I'll just share this. The urgency with which you probably felt when 8 years was mentioned to go ahead and do all you can now to make sure it's not 8 years, should remain with you after 2 years, should remain with you after 4 years. It should have remained with us 2 years ago. And all I'm saying is that in our culture, culture has a way of surviving personality. It survives the internal, accountability of police departments, as I've seen it. It survives mayors, it survives governors. So it is not necessarily about the personality that then has the ability to embody so much hate and evil. It's about the culture that has been baking that bread in the oven for so long. And no one cut the oven off. We turned it down, we did our best. People have been striving, I'm very clear about that. But I'm also very sure that there is something in this culture that we have to be clear about, that there's been too much power in few too many hands for far too long. And that's something about us as a people, continuing to remember who we are, where we come from, and what supports us. And what supports us in terms of spirituality is a gift. It's a gift of God's promise. And God's promise is available to each and every one of us. Not just because you have done something right, or it's not something that you are able to earn. It is looking at every single person that is in here today, and every single person that is outside of here today, and enacting and actualizing what does it mean to have God's promise on you. And I'll just share this one little piece. I was playing my nephew. This is a little bit of a break in tone, but I was playing my nephew over the winter break in his match game. He has these Marvel games where you can play matching. We're flipping it over. I was winning. I'm a hard uncle. I don't like to give any gifts. He's 7 years old, but he has to learn. So I'm flipping it over, and I'm winning. He pops up in the middle of that, and he says, "This is a rare opportunity to show you how truly powerful I am." I said, "Where did you get that from?" He said, "Superman." And I'm reaching to say this because he came back and actually beat me after he said that. And I was bewildered for a second, stuck with being happy that he did it, and then secondly, wondering how he did it. I think that's important to note in the sense that as a young person, I do honestly love intergenerational conversations and debates and thinking and planning. But one of the things that I try to encourage people to do is to realize, as I look at my elders who have done so much on our behalf, and I look at them and I thank them so much, and I thank my professors for the years of service that have been committed to scholarship. I thank you. But what I didn't realize is that my elders are looking at me and wondering about this gift that's inside of me, and when is it gonna break out? When is that gift inside of you gonna break out? When is it gonna be affirmed, not necessarily by others around you, but within you? I love the Paul Tillich, you are accepted, in this sense that in a society, if you have not been accepted into who you are, that's, I guess, the pastoral care moment that I think that could be ushered in, and that the National Truth and Reconciliation work of Dr. Fania Davis that I'm involved in offers us. It offers a moment of vulnerability for institutions and organizations to say, look, we're doing our best, we're striving, and not only are we pushing out for social justice, we're looking inward. Because what is it to do outward work without doing the inward work? So we have to continue to push ourselves, push on the organizations, push on the seminaries that are doing justice work out in the world. How do we become better internally? Because the structures and all of the things that we are supported by, I think are best fit when we do recognize a rare opportunity when it arrives. And when we do access that part of us that is powerful enough to demand of culture a better reality for all of us that live in it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, may I just add one thing quickly that I don't know if the question will come up, but I just think it needs to be spoken into the space. And that's that when we embark upon the troubles that are going to come related to religion in this administration, that it's very important for us to keep our eyes on the power dynamics and the fact that, for instance, for Muslims in this country, religious freedom means a different thing than it does for Christians. And at this moment, I think there's a lot of Christian accountability that needs to be discussed. And so those things that allow, people just to live their life and the bare minimum expressions of their faith are being coded the same way that the striving to take away the rights of marginalized populations are. And we have to be very, very attentive to that. Because there's, with FADA, there's a lot of railing against that, and we have to watch that tricky, ambiguous area there where there's a power discrepancy, is all I'm saying. And it's a big power discrepancy. So.
Gary, one final word? Let's open it up. Let's open it up. Okay. So we have a microphone here in the middle. If you come forward and just make your questions short, make them questions. And I see a hand over here, so just feel free to come up to the microphone.
Yes, my name is John Sonderborn, and I suggest that deeper than the problem of Donald Trump is the problem of the far too many Americans who are ready to sacrifice the principles of democracy and their concern for individual people for some promise of security. And I believe this is a problem of hope and of faith. And therefore, Christians or Christian communities or whatever need to find a way of offering hope and faith. And rather than just being negative or defending against what this administration may do, we have to take an affirmative view to try to reach people who will tell you they believe in loving their neighbor as themselves, and they're doing it in their communities, right? But not maybe the terrorists. They're there. We have to find a message of faith in this way. I attended the last meeting of the tour led by Reverend Barber, in which they toured the country, and they included the great preacher, Reverend Forbes, right? And throughout the whole program, they preached hate. And then they let him speak, and he gave a message of hope. And then they came down with hate at the end. He should tour the country with a message of hope. That's my suggestion.
Vicki, is that Vicki? Yes. Do you want to respond? Okay. All right. We'll let Vicki, and we'll take one more question, and then we'll have some responses.
Yes, I would just like to say, following up on that, the issue of security, that it's, you know, there's a political aim here, and that Islamophobia and all the other enemies in the basket are being used towards a very dangerous political aim, towards a very militaristic aim. And that we also need to recognize that if we are insecure, not as much as they tell us we are, it is precisely because of the policies we've carried out in the world. That, you know, the so-called Muslim threat comes from what the US government did in the Middle East in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And that we need to know that history in order to be able to correct and hold back on what's being put on us, because, you know, Trump is just going to use Islamophobia to, you know, let the waters loose. And we really need to look at how did we even get a terrorist organization that, you know, is holding us in check. How did we get that? And we got it precisely by what the US did in the Middle East.
Let's do one more question, and then we'll have a response. So, yes, come ahead.
Yeah, I actually have a practical question. We rely tremendously now, I think we all take hope, that as this administration engages in actions, there is the ability for ACLU and others to bring lawsuits. And really, most challenges are going to end up being constitutional challenges. Hopefully, the courts will stand up. With respect to the Johnson Amendment, if Republican Congress changes the tax code so that, that 501c3s can engage in political activity and the president signs it, is that it? Is there any challenge that you can bring to that? Or is that a legislative battle you simply have to win?
We're looking at it still. I mean, obviously, we think, you know, we think it implicates some of the questions around the separation of church and state that we could possibly try to raise finding the right clients, finding the right venue. It's mostly a political battle at the moment. I'm sorry, and then we'll go back to the other question about the roots of the fear and insecurity. I think it's going to be critical either in the litigation or in the legislative advocacy to have religious leadership, so that it doesn't look like the secularists fighting the religious institutions or or providing freedom to religious institutions. It's really got to come. The leadership has to come from folks like you. Going back to the question around where the fear and insecurity comes from, I mean, I think part of it's a great series of comments that people's fears have been augmented, they've been preyed upon, they have been scapegoated, and often it's our own government's actions which have fueled the very acts of terrorism that now our leaders decry. So mine is an organization, and I should have said this at some point, that actively defends some of the most notorious terrorist suspects. That's what we do. My client is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the purported mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. We've spent $6 million, I think, in his defense and on the defense of the 5 other high-value detainees that are still held at Guantanamo, the military commissions. We've been litigating and provide legal assistance with a team of lawyers who've been doing it for 10 years, since before Obama. We have also represented individuals that have been executed by our government. Khalid al-Masri was not executed, but he was attacked. Anwar al-Awlaki was attacked with a drone and executed by his government. He was a U.S. citizen in Yemen, not an active theater of war. We endeavored to stop the assassination of a U.S. citizen by the U.S. military force without judge, jury, executioner. So we defend terrorists. I say that openly. In the process of our legal defense of purported terrorists, you get to know your clients. You see the humanity of people that you never thought you could understand. It's not to excuse any of the acts of violence that any one of us does, but it paints a much more complicated picture. Mr. Mohammed's some of this I have to be careful how I say. I'm not supposed to know so much, and I'm not supposed to say much at all. It is my understanding that perhaps Mr. Mohammed, his wife and his 2 children were once in U.S. government custody, and that his 2 underage children, who were at the ages of that time 7 and 11, it is my belief that they were tortured by U.S. soldiers. It is my understanding that perhaps they were placed in a closed box with insects placed over their bodies, where they were led to believe that these would be biting insects of the young boys. And they threatened Mr. Mohammed's wife, I understand, with never seeing her sons again unless she were to tell them where Mr. Mohammed was. They were ultimately released. I believe they're someplace in northern Iran, in a place where they feel secure. And we have been endeavoring to make contact with them as a way to kind of show that the collateral damage of how our government prosecuted the war of terror against Mr. Mohammed affected these underage children of his family. Mr. Awlaki, who was assassinated by the U.S. government in Yemen, when they got him with a drone, they also mistakenly got his 16-year-old son, who went to Yemen in a search to find Dad. Dad had left and gone to Yemen. This little boy, U.S. citizen, big American accent, plays baseball. You see videos of him on our website. Wanted to find out what happened to Dad. Where's Waldo? Went to Yemen to find the father, and lamentably for the young boy, was also the subject of a drone bomb dropped on him as well, and we executed the son as well as the father, the sins of the father placed on the son. Now, most Americans don't have this conversation, right? We don't have this conversation. When we talk about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Anwar al-Awlaki, most politicians in Washington, D.C. don't see humanity, don't see families, don't see children, don't see narratives. And I think part of what I think the question is going at is that our government and our president now, by saying that he likes torture and he wants to do more of it, is only inciting further acts of terrorism and giving comfort to the very forces that would do harm and evil to good people of the world here and elsewhere. And we just don't have the complex enough narrative to really talk about why some of the chickens that have come home to roost are because we helped birth them. And it's the wrong metaphor, but it's really a part of the American complicity and the American violation of basic norms of human rights that have gotten us to this point. And I think that's part of a narrative that's just lost in this current moment.
Well,
but I will close on hope then, if we want to
go
close.
for the hope,
okay.
yes.
Look, the most important thing I can say, because I don't want to leave you with, I mean, this is a kind of a revival, not a funeral. It is incredible to see the public response, right? Since the election, right? My organization had 400,000 members before the election. On November 8th, we had 400,000 members. We count a member as someone who makes a $20 contribution. It's a very low-level price of admission, but we want to show that it's more than showing up or just signing an email petition. So the price of admission is $20 to be a card-carrying member. Since the election, over 1.2 million people have become a member of the ACLU, right? So. And they're everywhere. There are a lot in big cities, but they're in all the red states. They are, the per capita, we're doing the analysis now, the demographics and the analytics. It's mostly the growth per capita in red states and in rural communities is greater than in these big bastions of liberalism in the city. So it's really remarkable. We can put them to work. Right? These are younger people. The average age of my membership before the election was 70 years old. That was a young membership. Many of you are very youthful. I can see that some of you are my members. I'm not looking at you. But now we've got a new generation of folks, so we got to deploy them. And it's not just about, a contribution. It's about putting them to work and finding the meaningful ways for people to make a contribution. And so we're in the process of mobilizing a whole program of citizen activism to go from online to offline activism, and we have two buckets of activities. The one bucket I think might be interesting to folks like Wesley and others. One is obviously the political bucket, to put them in members of Congress, state legislatures, town halls, raucous town halls, fly-in visits, all this type of stuff that we normally do. But there's and we have more people than we can deploy properly into the political process. So the second bucket of activities are kind of individual acts of solidarity and support, where we're thinking about demonstrations of support in front of local mosques, right? Grab a whole bunch of people and show up with a sign on a day saying, we love you, we're here with you, we support you. Having people greet individuals coming out of naturalization ceremonies. The idea of hundreds of thousands of people are naturalized each year, and let's turn that into public theater of welcoming and support. Some of the ways in which we can show support in the detention centers, in the jails and the prisons, especially as more and more undocumented immigrants get detained. So figuring out ways of making sure that we can provide goods and services, making sure that there is always a way to provide kind of the care packages into our facilities and our detention centers, and let's flood them with kindness, even if they're behind bars on these policies. And I think tapping into that second bucket, where you don't have to become an uber political activist who is like a Rachel Maddow acolyte to do the type of advocacy, but you can just do good acts of ordinary kindness that are in your local communities, where you just feel like I was part of a solution and part of the answer to the problem. And I think that will go a very long way. It also sustains people, because part of what we worry about is that unless you need to have a way to sustain this energy and this momentum. And so I think it is unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's you know, I became director the week before 9/11 at the ACLU, and so I saw the crescendo and the reactions after 9/11. This is just politically very different. I've never seen, I'm 51 years old, so I'm definitely not a millennial. I've never seen this in my entire middle-aged life. You have so much to work with, Wesley. You have so much energy. You have so much kind of dynamism in both in you and in the broader public. And so let's let the young lead, and let's give you all the ability and the support and the push and the encouragement that your generation can, because there's nothing quite that we've seen like this in decades. And so it's really a clarion call to the new leaders and to the young leaders to take us where we may not want to go, or that we don't even know we want to go, but take us there and lead us there, and we will follow. We know how to follow leaders when they arise from among us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you. Thank you. This has been a wonderful discussion, and we have much work ahead. We have, all of us, many years prior to this in the struggle, and thank you for ending on that call to the young who will lead us. And in the midst of all of that, we were talking before we got started, and Wesley, you kept coming back to this theme too, of what it means to take care of ourselves, and to get rest and experience joy, and to have laughter and silliness and play with marbles and beat your uncle. But to be able to do that so that over a long period of time, we're able to sustain this work. So thank you for being here. And Gary, Jerusha, Wesley, thank you so much. And Wesley, end us.
Just want to
bring us home, okay?
A 15-second exercise my mother taught me when I was young. So if everyone could just stick your hands out in front of yourself. Some of you already know what this is, but it was just on my mind to do. All right, just shake your fingers a little bit. All right, move to the left or right. All right, just give yourself a hug. Just for self-sustaining, and you can always love yourself. Peace.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you all this evening.